Oddworld Slave Circus is an unreleased game Lorne Lanning spoke about a couple of times.
Hello, follow me.
Which seems understandably therefore to be one of the least known unreleased Oddworld games, I'd say. The game was first mentioned by Lorne publicly in December 2012 in a Reddit Ask Me Anything, in which he seemed to express a great deal of enthusiasm about the project, saying, "I've been fixated on a game called Oddworld Slave Circus. It is seriously whack. You start the game by buying a slave. Think gladiators on Oddworld." So it sounds like you would have played as some kind of manager buying slaves and either pitting them against each other in fights or training them up to use them in battles against other managers' slaves, I'd imagine. I wasn't sure if he was referencing a specific game called Gladiators when he said think gladiators on Oddworld, or if he was just comparing it to, historical gladiator arenas and gladiators in general. But in my research I did see that coincidentally there is actually a game set to come out later this year called Gladiators Manager, which, as you might expect, has a slightly similar concept, I'd say. The description says, "Gladiators Manager puts you in the position of a Lannister responsible for training and managing gladiators. Participating in brutal arena fights and cruel intrigues will grant you riches and glory in the ancient Roman Empire." Apparently Lorne worked on Oddworld Slave Circus for years, and in a Reddit post went on to say he's done a tremendous amount of work on this and I've never mentioned it, but it is in the carver and there may be some light for it down the road, but has some other contingencies depending on it. Considering it's nearly a decade later, it seems those contingencies unfortunately didn't align in its favour, as there's been no sign of it. And indeed, despite being very enthusiastic about it at the time, already less than a year after this, Lorne seemed less optimistic about the game in an article on video game magazine Computer and Video Games in October 2013, in which he said, "It was a little ahead of its time. It may still happen, but I never went out there promoting it as much as people think." On Reddit, Lorne had said that Slave Circus requires a new level of social integration into console gaming. It's insane. Hopefully not so insane it won't come to life. So I wonder what he meant by that, and if that's what he's referring to when he says it was ahead of its time. It's interesting to consider what he means exactly by social integration, whether he means something within the gameplay itself, as in like social interactions between characters and that type of thing maybe, or what I think he was referring to is more like a multiplayer element of how perhaps you would be able to buy your slaves, train them, fight them against other players' slaves and that kind of thing. But of course that's pretty standard multiplayer stuff. But I think at the time he wanted to create like a social media type of thing within the game, if that makes sense. Like maybe a world where your slave business would exist, competing among everyone else's, and being able to share videos and screenshots and that kind of thing, which consoles couldn't really do at the time as easily as they can now. But I'm probably extrapolating far too much from the phrase social integration. The reason I get this feeling is because shortly before this time, a year prior or so, Lorne was working on developing this kind of social media, if I understand correctly, which apparently was similar to record and share systems that ended up being implemented on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One consoles in 2013. So I wonder if he was intending to transfer that kind of idea into Oddworld Slave Circus maybe. I think he was a little ahead of his time with all these ideas, which is why I'm making the correlation between him saying Slave Circus was a little ahead of its time, might be in terms of the social integration element that he mentioned. Interestingly, Lorne says that he told Gabe Newell, the founder of Valve and developer of Steam, about Oddworld Slave Circus, and he loved it, but they're not a game publisher. He said, "I heard the title, I was turned off. Now that you've explained it, I think it would be great, it would work." So the indication that I get is that Oddworld Slave Circus primarily didn't end up being made because it was technologically out there and quite advanced, which is a shame considering a lot of work was done on the project supposedly. That being said, there's been no footage or even artwork or anything released of it. Literally, as far as I'm aware, all we know about it is just from the couple of times Lorne has briefly spoken about it. As a result, it's not too clear what state the game ended up in, but it must have been already developed to quite a reasonable degree, as Lorne said that around 2010 he was even trying to figure out where to get money to fund it. However, he was still adamant about not having to deal with publishers, due to his previous experiences with them messing him around, trying to change deals and playing games with Oddworld Inhabitants, such as Majesco Entertainment did in 2005 with the brutal ballad of Fangor's Clot, that resulted in Oddworld Inhabitants shutting down. In a 2013 article, he said of Slave Circus, 3 years ago I was out there looking for ways to finance it, and I wasn't talking to any publishers. I don't talk to them, there's no point. I don't care for the terms, I don't want to play. I would do it with certain people, but I'd want them to own it from the start. Computer and video games hints that if Slave Circus was made, it would be the last Oddworld game to come out in a physical medium, as at the time, Lorne was basically saying that the future of game publishing is in digital distribution. Considering all Oddworld games have been released primarily in digital form since that time, with physical releases being special editions, it seems that this was predicted correctly. The concept of Oddworld Slave Circus reminds me of what I've heard about a game I've never played called Darkest Dungeon that got released in 2016. From what I understand, in this game you would hire and manage heroes to explore dungeons, but the game would involve the emotional and mental toll this would have on heroes as well, so you'd also have to manage them in that way as individuals. For example, I think if you send a hero down a dungeon too many times, they get stressed out and start drinking alcohol and stuff like that. It's not just a manage a bunch of characters and have them fight for you kind of thing. You also have to take into account how your actions and management style affects the people you control. The idea is that it plays on your morality, in terms of if you try to be nice and whatever and take into account how they're feeling and what your actions are doing to them, but maybe because of that you won't do so well, because you're not training them as much as they can be, and as a result they won't be as good at fighting. Or you can be completely corporate and heartless, and just push them extremely hard and have them do well, until eventually they become absolutely useless to you and you can just discard them and get new guys in. So I wonder if this might have been an element Oddworld Slave Circus would have looked at as well, or maybe something similar. Oddworld does seem to always deal in morality to some degree, and how you play a game in general changes the outcome and that kind of thing. Overall, Slave Circus seems like it would have been a really fun, interesting and unique addition to the Oddworld franchise that would have been a complete departure from the type of gameplay seen in every other Oddworld game so far. And as a result, I think it's really a great shame that nothing has ended up coming out of this project, but who knows, Lorne said he spent a lot of time on it, so maybe it might still happen, considering that work surely wouldn't have just disappeared. I doubt it considering how long it's been, but you never know. It certainly would be nice if we finally got to see something of Oddworld Slave Circus.
Hello, follow me.